Your awakening has become your prison. The truth you fought so hard to see now leaves you paralyzed in a void of meaninglessness. Somewhere along your path of spiritual revelation, you felt the ground shift beneath you. You pierced through the veil of illusion, saw the machinery of your patterns escape the deafening noise of the world, and then came the silence. At first, that silence felt sacred, empowering, like stepping out of a burning building into clean air. But slowly, subtly, meaning dissolved. Not as a catastrophe, but as a quiet disappearance, as if your soul dimmed the lights on life and forgot to turn them back on. You stopped striving. You stopped performing, not out of despair, but in a kind of sacred exhaustion, a hollowing that felt strangely peaceful yet unnervingly still. And then the whisper began, that quiet, aching question that haunts you now. Why do I feel so empty now that I finally see the truth? This is the paradox no one warns you about, the brutal reality they hide from you. You were led to believe that spiritual awakening would inflame your purpose, that seeing through illusion would make you burn with clarity. But for you, the sensitive one, the seeker, the inward traveler, it did something else entirely. It emptied your vessel. It scraped out all false motives until even desire became unrecognizable. And in that void, you've confused awakening with apathy. Think about it. You emerged from your dark night of the soul with crystalline insight. You saw through the illusions of identity, achievement, external validation. And yet now you lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, adrift in a stillness you never expected. I used to cry about not doing enough, you tell yourself. Now I don't care if I do anything at all. I thought awakening would set me on fire. Instead, I feel extinguished. Do you recognize yourself in these words? Are you brave enough to admit it? Look at your life now. The goals abandoned, the ambitions that no longer ignite you, the strange indifference to outcomes that once consumed you. You've entered the wilderness between worlds, and society has no map for this territory. Friends ask what's wrong with you. Family wonders why you've lost your drive. Therapists may even pathologize your condition, suggesting depression when what you're experiencing is dismantlement, the necessary unraveling before rebirth. The brutal truth is this: genuine awakening is not a peak experience that leaves you empowered and certain. It's a demolition project. It tears down the false structures of your psyche with merciless precision. The person you thought you were, the achiever, the people pleaser, the spiritual seeker, the identity you crafted so carefully, that person is dying. Of course you feel unmotivated. The very self that was motivated is dissolving before your eyes. Your former rewards no longer satisfy you. Approval feels hollow. Achievement feels empty. Money, status, recognition, these currencies once drove your every action. Now they feel like counterfeit coins in your hand. This isn't depression, it's awakening to the bankruptcy of values you once lived by. The machine of your former life continues to operate, but you've stepped outside it, and now you see it for what it is, a contraption of conditioning, not the truth of who you are. What terrifies you most is not the emptiness itself, but what it implies. If you are not your achievements, not your relationships, not your spiritual insights, not your contributions to the world, then what remains? Who are you when everything familiar has been stripped away? This existential nakedness is what you're really facing. And in a culture that equates identity with output, that measures worth through visible contribution, your stillness looks like surrender, your silence seems like defeat. But what if this emptiness is not your enemy? What if this void is the most honest relationship you've ever had with existence? What if this seeming darkness is actually clarity, finally seeing through the artificial light of false purpose that kept you running on a wheel going nowhere? Your motivation hasn't died, it's being reborn from a deeper source. But between deaths and rebirths, there is always a void, always a tomb, always a necessary darkness. Carl Jung speaks directly to this threshold. He saw it clearly, this sacred terrain between the collapse of the ego and the birth of the self. A liminal space, terrifying in its quiet, where motivation once powered by persona and social approval dissolves, leaving only the raw clay of what has not yet been shaped. This is not failure. This is individuation, the chrysalis stage of the psyche where the caterpillar dissolves into formlessness before becoming the butterfly. It is the psychological death required for rebirth. But you must not mislabel this void as regression. For in the heart of this emptiness lives a deeper call, a quiet pulse of soul truth waiting to be heard. Not the motivation to prove, but the impulse to be. To move not out of need for recognition, but out of inner resonance. Jung, the architect of analytical psychology, foresaw this strange and silent fog that descends after awakening long before it became a topic in modern spiritual circles. He didn't cloak it in mysticism or euphoric language. He spoke with piercing clarity about the soul's descent into its own depths once the unconscious begins to stir. Enlightenment, Jung wrote, does not come by imagining figures of light but by making the darkness conscious. And while those words may sound poetic, they carry a terrible truth you must now face. Real awakening does not crown you with bliss. It strips you. It unravels the scaffolding of your false self. It initiates a slow and sacred death, the death of who you believed yourself to be. The collapse is internal but far-reaching. Your former motives, ambition, achievement, recognition, begin to dissolve. The timelines you followed, the goals that once pulled you forward, even the structures of identity that defined your relationships, your work, your daily rhythm, all begin to fade like mirages in the light of a deeper truth. But here's the psychological nuance vital for you to understand. Your ego does not disappear. It does not die. It simply becomes disoriented. The script it once followed has been burned, but no new script has yet emerged. The result is not laziness or apathy, but a profound spiritual limbo. You are no longer asleep, but you are not yet fully awake into what comes next. This threshold is where most spiritual seekers become lost, confused, or retreat back into old patterns. When the promises of immediate transformation and perpetual bliss prove false, when the void stretches longer than expected, many conclude they've failed. They look around at others still burning with purpose, still certain of their direction, and they think, "What's wrong with me? Why can't I feel that fire anymore?" Nothing is wrong with you. You've simply gone deeper than most are willing to go. You've had the courage to stay in the dismantling, to witness the collapse of false structures without rushing to build new ones just as false. Most people, when faced with this void, immediately fill it with new spiritual practices, with bypassing positivity, with frantic social engagement, with anything to avoid the silence where the ego has no dominance. But you've stayed in the emptiness, in the stillness, in the space where nothing is certain and everything is possible. This is not cowardice, it is profound bravery. It is the warrior's stance in the face of non-being. Jung understood the privilege and terror of this position. He knew that true transformation, not the cosmetic change of swapping one identity for another, but the alchemical transmutation of consciousness itself, required a passage through dissolution. The alchemists called it solve et coagula, dissolve and recombine. Before new structures can form, old ones must be reduced to their essential elements. Your psyche is not broken. It is following an ancient pattern of death and rebirth that our culture has forgotten how to honor. In traditional societies, initiatory ordeals often included periods of isolation, sensory deprivation, fasting, all designed to create a ritual death of the old identity before the initiate could be reborn into new wisdom. These societies understood what modern spiritual marketplace ignores. There is no transformation without dismemberment. There is no rebirth without death. And now you stand in the tomb of your former self, surrounded by the remnants of who you once were, facing the terror of non-being, of not knowing, of having no definitive answer to the question, who am I now? This is the crucible that forms diamonds from coal. This is the fire that tempers steel. This is the darkness that gives birth to stars. This is the mystery Jung called the Negrido, the blackening phase of alchemy when the ego has been dismantled, but the self has not yet taken the throne. In modern terms, it looks like demotivation, but in Jungian language, it is a holy pause, an in-between space where the soul retreats inward to rewrite its myth. And yet our culture fears this silence. Jung warned that the modern world does everything it can to avoid this phase, to pathologize it, numb it, medicate it, because it cannot comprehend a transformation that doesn't look like progress. But what you're experiencing is not regression. It is initiation. It is not dysfunction. It is sacred descent. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may share its shadows. It is the soul refusing to participate in a life it no longer resonates with. And that, Jung believed, was the beginning of individuation, the sacred becoming of the true self. Most people never speak of this part, do they? The ache after the light, the silence after the revelation. But this silence is not empty. It is formative. And if you can learn to stand still inside it, to listen to what it asks of you, you may come to see that what looks like demotivation is actually the beginning of a deeper alignment. The world tells you you're lost. Jung would say you are being reformed by something far more honest. If you've been drifting through the haze that follows awakening, staring into the stillness where your spark once burned bright, know this: you are not broken. You are undergoing a profound psychic shift that our culture has no name for. A metamorphosis so deep it does not merely challenge your thoughts, it reconfigures the very architecture of your inner world. The ambitions that once lit a fire in your chest, the deadlines, the goals, the 5-year visions, the motivational mantras of hustle, now fall flat. Not because you failed, but because the very structure that once housed your motivation is disintegrating. Think of motivation as a function of identity. When you believed you were your achievements, achievement motivated you. When you identified with your reputation, approval energized you. When you saw yourself as a spiritual seeker, the next insight pulled you forward. But awakening has shown you the provisional nature of all these identities. They are masks, roles, temporary configurations, not your essence. And so the motivation attached to them naturally falls away. This dissolution terrifies the world around you because it threatens consensus reality. If you can wake up from the collective dream of ambition, achievement, and accumulation, what's to stop others from awakening too? If being productive no longer compels you, if success no longer seduces you, if the rat race suddenly looks exactly like what it is, rats racing, then the entire social order is at risk. Your stillness is revolutionary. Your silence is sedition. Your refusal to participate in meaningless striving is a threat to a system built on exactly that. So they will try to pull you back. They will diagnose, prescribe, criticize, worry. They'll tell you to get help when what they really mean is get back in line. They'll suggest therapy when they actually mean compliance. They'll express concern when they really feel fear, fear that your awakening might reveal the hollowness of their own driven lives. The true sickness is not your disillusionment. It's the collective delusion that meaning can be found in endless doing without being. It's the shared madness that worth comes from production rather than presence. It's the mass hypnosis that has us measuring life by its outputs rather than its depth. Jung saw through this societal trance decades ago. He witnessed the sickness of a civilization severed from soul, frantically accumulating and achieving to fill the void left by the absence of meaning. He understood that what looks like normal functioning in such a society is actually pathological, an adaptation to a profoundly sick system. And by those standards, your dysfunction may be the sanest response possible. Your motivation hasn't disappeared, it has become more discriminating. It now moves only for what is real, what is true, what comes from soul rather than from should. Jung foresaw this unraveling long before it was ever whispered on digital platforms. Let's understand it clearly. For most of your life, your energy came from the persona, the constructed self, the mask you wore to move through the world. That identity, the one who wanted to be admired, validated, applauded, was not a flaw. It was a necessary stage of human development. As Jung wrote, the persona is a system of behavior which is imposed upon the individual by the expectations of society. But when you awaken, you begin to see the mask for what it is, a performance. And the performance no longer compels you. You can't chase applause once you've seen that the stage is made of illusion. The result: the goals you once revered now feel foreign. They were written by a self that no longer lives in you. This creates an eerie silence within, like an actor stepping off stage and forgetting their lines, not out of confusion, but because the script no longer resonates with the soul. You feel aimless, not because you've lost your direction, but because you've shed the identity that required a destination. You didn't lose your drive. You outgrew the fuel that once powered it. What stirs within you now is not absence, but a sacred pause, a quiet void preparing to be filled by something truer, something no longer forged from performance, but from presence. The ego pushed, the soul waits, and in that waiting, something holy begins. Carl Jung believed that the aim of life is not to exalt the ego, but to integrate it into a larger, deeper psychic totality. We are not here to serve the ego's desires, but to refine it, temper it, and align it with the self, the transcendent center of our being that connects us to the greater whole. He called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of moving from fragmentation to inner unity. not to become the self that is praised, but to become the self that is real. The self, unlike the ego, is unconcerned with approval or performance. It is not driven by ambition but by alignment. Its only desire is to express what is true. You must understand how radical this shift truly is. The ego operates through acquisition. It wants to gain, to have, to hold, to build. It is fueled by lack and seeks to fill that lack through constant doing. The self operates through revelation. It wants to unveil, to express, to embody, to become. It is fueled by wholeness and moves from fullness rather than emptiness. When the ego drives, you are constantly in pursuit, never arriving. When the self leads, you are already home, simply deepening into what already is. This is why the transition feels so disorienting. You've been running your entire life, and suddenly you realize there is nowhere to go. You've been climbing ladders only to discover they were leaning against the wrong wall. You've been seeking outside what has always lived within. This realization doesn't immediately translate to new action. First, it requires a period of unraveling, of letting go, of surrendering all the strategies you've used to navigate life thus far. The spiritual ego often tries to bypass this stage, moving quickly from one form of striving to another, from material ambition to spiritual attainment. But the self doesn't want achievement. It wants authenticity. Your soul isn't interested in your resume, your bank account, your follower count, or even your meditation practice. It cares only for what is real. And uncovering what is real within you requires a willingness to be stripped of all pretense, all performance, all the layers of conditioned identity you've accumulated over a lifetime. This is not a weekend workshop or a 30-day challenge. This is the work of a lifetime, unfolding in cycles of death and rebirth. So when your ambition falters, when your carefully constructed plans no longer energize you, when you find yourself staring into space instead of hustling toward goals, recognize this as the call of something deeper. Your soul is not willing to move in directions that aren't aligned with your truth anymore. It refuses to power projects that come from fear rather than love, from lack rather than fullness, from the need to prove rather than the desire to serve. This looks like dysfunction only in a world obsessed with productivity at any cost. In reality, it is the beginning of a new way of being, one that flows from the inside out rather than being driven from the outside in. And so, after a spiritual awakening, your psyche begins a sacred recalibration. What once felt exciting now feels hollow. Your system begins to reject everything artificial, forced, or inauthentic. That includes careers built from insecurity, relationships based on roles, or even the vision board you crafted from your old self's fear of not being enough. This inner purification often feels like liberation and disorientation at the same time. You're shedding the false, but what now takes its place? Jung cautioned that many get stuck here. Some awaken and fall into spiritual bypassing, mistaking transcendence for escape. They float above life, call everything an illusion, and convince themselves nothing matters. But detachment is not the same as disconnection. The self does not want you to disappear from the world. It wants to inhabit it through you. It wants to incarnate, not evacuate. It seeks not withdrawal, but embodiment. But before that embodiment, there is a threshold, and Jung described it well, though few recognize it when they are in it. It is the gray space after awakening, the void that comes not with bliss but with bewilderment. It doesn't look poetic. It doesn't trend. It looks like sitting quietly while the world speeds past, unable to explain who you are becoming. Jung would say, you are not failing. You are in between. You have stepped out of the ego, but the self has not yet become your foundation. This liminal space is not a mistake. It is initiation, a descent into the unknown that modern culture has no patience for. Stillness is misdiagnosed as laziness. Pause is confused for paralysis. So you begin to judge yourself, and that judgment becomes the very wall that blocks the energy your soul is calling home. This phase is sacred. It is chrysalis, not collapse. And if you can stay here long enough, if you can resist the urge to rush or retreat, you will begin to feel it, the quiet pulse of something deeper rising. The self is not loud, but it is constant, and it is waiting for you to trust what cannot yet be named. You live in a world desperate for certainty, addicted to answers, terrified of the unknown. A world that wants to categorize, label, and package everything, including transformation. But real metamorphosis defies these attempts at containment. It follows ancient rhythms the modern mind has forgotten but the body still remembers. When a snake sheds its skin, there is a period when it is vulnerable, when it must retreat from the world, when its vision clouds over before clarity returns. When a crab molts its shell, it must hide from predators, soft and defenseless, until the new exoskeleton hardens. When a seed germinates, it must first crack open and die to its seedhood before the shoot can emerge. Nature understands what humanity has forgotten. Growth requires vulnerability. Transformation demands surrender. Becoming necessitates a willingness to be unmade. Your current state of demotivation, of existential limbo, is not a detour from your path. It is the path itself, the path of descent before ascent, the path of emptying before filling, the path of dying before being reborn. Modern spiritual circles glamorize awakening without honoring its cost. They promise peak experiences without the valleys that give them context. They sell transcendence without the necessary descent into the underworld of the psyche, where the shadows dwell, where the discarded aspects of self await integration. Jung knew better. He understood that wholeness requires darkness as well as light, depth as well as height, death as well as life. The psyche moves not in straight lines but in spirals, not always forward, but often circling back to retrieve what was left behind. This is why your awakening has led not to perpetual bliss, but to a confrontation with everything within you that remains unresolved, unhealed, unlived. All the grief you never fully felt, all the rage you never fully expressed, all the needs you learned to deny. They rise to the surface now, not to torment you, but to be finally acknowledged, honored, integrated. Your ego, trained to see these aspects as enemies, as flaws to be overcome, resists this process with all its might. It wants to maintain the illusion of control, of progress, of spirituality as an achievement rather than a surrender. But the deeper wisdom of your soul knows that nothing can be transcended that has not first been embraced. Nothing can be transformed that has not first been fully faced and owned. Carl Jung had a word for this sacred reversal of energy, enantiodromia, the phenomenon where something, when taken to its extreme, transforms into its opposite. Nowhere is this more evident than in the aftermath of awakening. You move from the manic striving of ego, I must do everything, to the hollow stillness of soul, why do anything at all? The pendulum swings not because you're broken, but because balance demands it. The psyche, long imprisoned in performance, finally collapses into rest. And this descent is not pathology, it is initiation. In the language of myth, this is the archetype of the hermit, the withdrawal from the world before rebirth. It is the sacred cocoon where the caterpillar dissolves into formlessness. No longer a crawling self, not yet a flying one. It is the goo phase, unstructured, undefined, unproductive by every modern standard, but necessary because the psyche is undergoing alchemical transformation. And transformation, Jung would say, begins in darkness, not in bypassing, not in good vibes only, but in descent. This is where modern spirituality often loses its depth, by glamorizing awakening while avoiding its crucifixion. Jung insisted that the shadow, the rejected, uncomfortable, unconscious parts of ourselves, is not something to escape but something to integrate. Shadow work is not advanced-level spirituality. It is the very foundation of becoming whole. And in this state of nothingness you now occupy, the unconscious is rising not as a villain but as a messenger. What you once repressed, your grief, your rage, your unmet needs, begins to surface because now, at last, there is space. So the ego panics. It wants action, clarity, a name tag. But this is where the real work begins. Not in achievement, but in surrender. Not in clarity, but in witnessing. The psyche is not malfunctioning. It is metabolizing years of noise, illusion, and false striving. It halts your drive, your ambition, your hunger, so you have no choice but to sit with what you've buried. And it is in that stillness, in that haunting void, that you begin to remember. You've been told your entire life that meaning comes through doing, that purpose is something you find outside yourself, that your worth is measured by what you produce. These lies have driven you into exhaustion, fragmentation, and alienation from your own soul. And now, in the silence that follows awakening, these lies can no longer sustain themselves. They crumble before the weight of your awakened gaze. The void you fear is not empty, it's pregnant with potential. It is the quantum field of pure possibility before form emerges. It is the blank canvas before the painting. It is the silence between notes that makes music possible. But to access its creative power, you must surrender to it completely. You must stop trying to escape it, fix it, or fill it with premature action. This surrender is not passive. It is the most courageous act possible in a world addicted to control. To stand empty-handed in the face of uncertainty, to remain open when every instinct screams to close down, to trust the process when no outcome is guaranteed. This is spiritual warriorship of the highest order. Jung knew that the call to individuation is not a gentle invitation, but a summons that will tear your life apart if refused. The unconscious will not be denied indefinitely. What you repress will return with increasing force until you either break open or break down. The choice is not whether to face the void, but how, consciously or unconsciously, willingly or through crisis, with awareness or in blind suffering. You are being asked to die while still alive, to let go of who you thought you were so that who you truly are can emerge. This death is not literal but symbolic, not final but transformative. It is the death of illusion, of false identity, of the stories you've told yourself about who you are and what life means. And then, almost imperceptibly, something stirs. A new form of motivation arises, but it is nothing like the old. It is not born of anxiety. It is not urgent or performative. It does not roar, it hums. A soul-led impulse to move, not because you must, but because it would be a betrayal of truth not to. Jung called this the emergence of the self, not as an abstract ideal, but as a living, breathing compass within. It does not chase, it calls. And what it calls you toward is not success, but wholeness. So you've crossed the threshold and stood in the silence. You've tasted stillness not as stagnation, but as sacred pause. You've wandered through the inner night where no voice called out and no light showed the way. And now something ancient begins to stir, not as a roar, not as lightning, but as a quiet inner knowing, a soft pulse that does not urge you to return to what was but invites you to build what has never yet been. This is the first whisper of the self, not in language but in feeling, in pull, in presence. Jung called this the symbolic life, a life no longer ruled by ego or convention, but guided by the deeper forces of the soul. Once the ego has surrendered and the unconscious is honored, life ceases to be a game of survival and becomes an unfolding of meaning. And here's the paradox. It may look beautifully ordinary. When the self begins to lead, you no longer hustle, you respond. You're not driven by the fear of missing out, but by the quiet conviction of inner alignment. You stop chasing clarity as a prize and begin recognizing it when it arrives, often dressed in simplicity. Living from the self does not mean you'll always be energized or certain. Fatigue, doubt, and grief still pass through. This is the texture of human life. But what disappears is the constant ache of self-betrayal, the dull exhaustion of performing a version of yourself that no longer fits. Instead, something shifts. You find yourself creating even when no one applauds, saying no even when yes is expected, following wonder rather than ticking boxes. You begin choosing peace over performance. This is not inertia, it's a new fuel. Not adrenaline but alignment, not pressure but presence. The ego's motivation comes from what Jung called the pleasure principle or the avoidance of pain. It moves either toward what it desires or away from what it fears. It is reactive, conditioned, predictable. The self's motivation arises from what Jung might call the meaning principle or the desire for wholeness. It moves toward integration, embodiment, and authentic expression. It is responsive, unconditioned, surprising. When you look at those who have survived this transition, who have moved through the void after awakening and emerged not perfect but more whole, you see a striking pattern. They no longer chase the external markers of success that once drove them, but neither do they withdraw from meaningful engagement with the world. Instead, they participate differently, with more presence, more discernment, more compassion both for themselves and others. They may still achieve, create, or lead, but the energy behind these actions has fundamentally shifted. It no longer comes from lack, from the need to prove themselves or fill an inner emptiness. It flows from fullness, from the desire to express what lives within, from love rather than fear. Their ambition has been transformed into what we might call soul purpose, not a goal to be achieved, but a quality of being to be embodied. They move through life not as hunters tracking prey, but as dancers responding to music only they can hear. Their actions emerge not from should but from could, not from obligation but from possibility. This is the promise on the other side of the void. Not that you will never again feel lost, confused, or uncertain, but that even within those states, you will be oriented by something deeper than your thoughts, steadier than your emotions, truer than your conditioned patterns. Not that you will always know what to do, but that you will learn to trust what moves you from within, even when it makes no rational sense, even when it defies convention, even when it requires courage no one else can see or validate. Jung understood that this reorientation toward the self is not a one-time event, but a lifelong process with cycles of death and rebirth, loss and discovery, darkness and illumination. The path is not linear but spiral, returning again and again to similar themes but at deeper levels. Jung called this living symbolically, not as an escape into fantasy but as a return to soul. You begin to trust the language of dreams, gut instincts, symbols, and synchronicities. Your life becomes a dialogue, not a monologue shouted into the void, but a conversation with the unseen. And what does that look like? Sometimes it's as subtle as different questions, not what should I do, but what is quietly calling me, not what's the plan, but where is life nudging me, not how can I prove myself, but what feels true. You stop trying to dominate life and start participating with it. Ambition doesn't vanish, it transforms. It becomes devotion. Devotion to what is real, what is true, what brings you alive. And strangely, that devotion moves mountains. It gets things done, but from wholeness, not depletion. Now it is sustainable. Now it is soul-powered. This is the self's motivation, not to impress, but to express. And it leads you, often without effort, to create, to teach, to heal, to serve. Not because you should, but because your whole being says yes. So if you've been wondering where your spark went after awakening, remember, it's not gone. The old fire burned away so a deeper flame could emerge, one that won't flicker in the storms of the world. Jung never promised ease, but he did promise depth. If you are here, reading this, then you are already walking the path. This is not the end of your awakening. It is the beginning of your becoming. The world will tell you you're regressing. They'll mistake your stillness for stagnation, your inward journey for escapism, your refusal to perform for laziness. Stand firm in your truth. The caterpillar does not apologize for its dissolution, and neither should you. Trust the wisdom of your disintegration. Honor the sacred pause between who you were and who you are becoming. And know that this void is not empty. It is pregnant with possibility, with authenticity, with soul. This is your initiation. Will you have the courage to be unmade? Will you trust what cannot yet be named? The choice is yours alone, and everything depends on it. Jung observed that modern civilization suffers from soul loss, a severance from the deeper currents of meaning, purpose, and connection that once sustained human life. We have gained efficiency but lost essence. We have conquered the external world but forgotten the inner one. We have amassed information but lost wisdom. Your awakening has shown you this truth not as an abstract concept, but as lived reality. You've glimpsed the emptiness beneath the promises of consumer culture, the hollowness behind the facade of success, the profound alienation that comes from living entirely on the surface of life. And unlike those still slumbering in the collective trance, you can no longer pretend not to see. This seeing comes with responsibility. Not the burden of fixing the world or converting others, but the sacred obligation to live differently, to embody the truth you've glimpsed, however imperfectly, to stand as a living reminder that another way is possible. Your demotivation is not a failure of will, but a recalibration of values. Your former drives serve the ego's agenda of accumulation, achievement, and approval. Your emerging motivation serves the soul's longing for authenticity, meaning, and connection. This is not a regression, but an evolution, from the unconscious striving of the first half of life to the conscious becoming of the second. Jung believed that the crisis of modern humanity is fundamentally spiritual in nature, not religious in the conventional sense, but spiritual in that it concerns our relationship to meaning, to purpose, to the sacred dimension of existence. When we lose contact with this dimension, we experience what he called neurosis, a divided state where we are at war with ourselves, where what we do contradicts what we deeply know to be true. Your awakening has brought this inner division to light. It has shown you the gap between the life you've been living and the truth you can no longer deny. And now you stand at a crossroads. Will you numb this awareness with new distractions, new goals, new spiritual bypassing? Or will you have the courage to remain in the tension of not knowing, trusting that a new way of being is being born within you? The path of individuation requires what Jung called the tension of opposites, the capacity to hold contradictory truths without collapsing into either extreme. You are both broken and whole. You are both lost and found. You are both dying and being born. This paradox is not a problem to solve, but a mystery to live into. As you navigate this threshold, be gentle with yourself. The caterpillar does not transform into a butterfly through force of will, but through surrender to an intelligence greater than its own. Your psyche knows how to heal itself if given the space and time to do so. Trust the process, even when, especially when, it makes no rational sense. And remember, you are not alone in this journey. Though it may feel isolating, though few may understand what you're experiencing, you walk a path that mystics, shamans, and seekers have traveled for millennia. The language may differ, the context may change, but the essential process remains the same. Death before rebirth, emptying before filling, darkness before dawn. This is the hero's journey, not as escapist fantasy, but as psychological reality. The call to adventure, the threshold crossing, the road of trials, the abyss, the resurrection, the return with the elixir. All of these mythic stages describe the actual process of psychological transformation that you are undergoing now. Your motivation will return, but it will come from a deeper source. It will move you not from behind, like a whip driving you forward, but from ahead, like a beacon calling you home. It will feel less like ambition and more like love. Love for what is true, what is beautiful, what is worthy of your life energy. This is what Jung meant when he said, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." Not the ego's choice based on fear and conditioning, but the soul's choice based on love and truth. Not what you achieve, but who you become in the process. Not the outer trappings of success, but the inner quality of your being. The void is not your enemy. It is the womb of your becoming. Trust it. Surrender to it. And watch as life begins to move through you in ways you never could have imagined or engineered. This is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of a life truly worth living.